Before we begin today's episode, I want to warn you that from the start, we'll be discussing sexual violence and rape. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome back to OUTLORE Podcast. I'm Eleanor Neale, and in today's episode, we're in South Africa in 2008, where the body of a women's footballing hero was discovered beaten, bloody, and partially clothed. Her name was Eudy Simelane. She was 31 years old when she was murdered and her body dumped in a shallow ditch. When the news broke, you would expect there to be outrage, and there was, but not as much as you would think, because devastatingly, this kind of thing had come to be expected. Eudy was a lesbian living in the South African townships, and in the townships, no lesbian is safe from the violent phenomenon that is corrective rape. Outlaw. Have you ever heard a man say, "One night with me and I'll turn you straight"? Lesbians are sick of hearing stuff like this. I mean, recently we've seen that exact thing happen on national television on Celebrity Big Brother UK when Mickey Rourke told Jojo Siwa, "If I stay longer than 4 days, you won't be gay anymore. I'll tie you up."
If I stay longer than 4 days, you won't be gay anymore.
I can guarantee I will still be gay and I will still be in a very happy relationship.
I'll tie you up.
The men that talk like this think that it's just like a funny throwaway line, that it's unserious, that it's just a joke. But for many lesbian women, this is a real threat that they are faced with every day. Men forcing themselves on them. And there's actually a name for this. It's called corrective rape. It's a threat, and far too often, it's actually carried out. The intent behind corrective rape is to either punish or quote-unquote cure gay people of their sexuality. And in South Africa, for black lesbians living in the townships, it's estimated that 10 cases of corrective rape are taking place every week. It's a national emergency, and it isn't a new one. It's been happening for decades, and this term corrective rape wasn't widely used or understood on a global scale until 2008, which is when today's case takes place. And I quickly want to warn you that on top of rape and sexual violence, we'll be covering a whole load of other sensitive subjects today around homophobia, racism, and murder. This is going to be a very heavy one, but a very, very important episode. So once again, viewer discretion is advised. Eudy Simelane was born on the 11th of March 1977. Her mother, Mally, actually chose the name Eudy for her because she was reading this particular book at the time, and there was a female character in there called Eudy. And she was so inspired by this character. She was such a strong woman, full of perseverance, and when she was pregnant, Mama Mally knew that she wanted her daughter to grow up to be exactly like the Eudy in this book. And you'll see throughout this episode that Eudy Simelane really lived up to her name. When Mama Mally gave birth to Eudy in 1977, this wasn't her first child. Eudy had an older brother named Bafana, who was actually the one that inspired Eudy's passion for football. He taught her everything in the beginning, and they would play together all the time. The siblings were very close, and I mean, they kind of had to be because they shared a bedroom, and from a very young age, Eudy was decorating that whole room with football posters and memorabilia, and she was only 4 years old when her parents realised that they had a promising young footballer on their hands. Not only did Eudy adore the sport, but she was damn good at it as well. She was playing not just with her own older brother, but all of his friends too, and they weren't exactly beating her. This is like a 4-year-old girl. Her parents had expected Eudy to be an active kid since they were a very sporty family. Her brother played on local teams, her dad was into football, her mum just loved all sports. So when their 4-year-old daughter starts playing like a mini pro, they couldn't have been prouder. From a young age, Eudy was also given the nickname Styles because of how skillfully she played with her left foot. Eudy just loved being recognised for her talent and for her passion for the sport. But her skill in football wasn't the only thing about Eudy that garnered attention. Her looks were very intriguing to a lot of people because she was a classic tomboy. I'm sure you can imagine, in a very conservative, traditional township, going against the grain like this was never going to set her up for an easy ride. Eudy was born and raised in a township southeast of Johannesburg called Kwa Thema, and life was not very easy living there. Such is the case for most, if not all, townships. Townships were designated residential areas for black families to live in during apartheid, which took place in South Africa officially between 1948 and 1994. Most townships were made by the government to enforce racial segregation. They'd often forcibly remove black families from their homes because those homes were too close to white people, and instead they were made to move to live in townships much further away. By the time of this case, in 2008, shockwaves from the apartheid still rippled through South Africa. Obviously, it was going to have ramifications for decades following. And one of the areas where you've always been able to see the consequences of apartheid most is in these townships, like the one that Eudy lived in Kwa Thema. Eudy was born in 1977, so for most of her childhood and teenage years, segregation was still in full swing. Her family, as well as every other non-white family in South Africa, were made to live in huge economic, social, and educational disparity compared with their white neighbours. Poverty, unemployment, and lack of education funding were serious issues. Crime rates were through the roof, and so was religious fanaticism. People had extreme intolerant views. There arguably wasn't a group of people who suffered more during this time in the townships than people who were both black and LGBTQ. Specifically, lesbians, and to narrow it down even further, masculine presenting lesbians, the masks. And Eudy was one of them. By 12 years old, she knew who she was, and she made no secret of it. Her school even initially confused her for being a boy because she refused to wear the girl's uniform. She only ever wanted to play football. She wasn't your typical little girl. Eudy faced more and more issues as she grew into an adult, but by far the most terrifying thing looming over her was the threat of corrective rape. In South Africa, mask-presenting lesbians faced the highest risk of being targeted, attacked, and raped to quote-unquote cure their sexuality. In 2022, it was found that up to 500,000 men in South Africa had assaulted women over the course of a 12-month period. 500,000, let that sink in. Those are modern statistics, even after cases like the one that we're discussing today. And we know that many of these men had targeted their victims because they were dressed and were presenting more masculine. In fact, butch was the word that was used. Corrective rape is such a long-running threat to masked women, and back in the 80s and 90s, Eudy, as well as all of her family, knew that she would be considered the perfect target to potential perpetrators of corrective rape. Don't get me wrong, her family supported her wholeheartedly in everything that she did, in how she identified, in how she presented. They cheered her on through her football matches. They knew that the Eudy that they had was the happiest version of her, so she was completely accepted for who she was at home. Back when she was only a kid, her grandma actually expressed some concerns about how Eudy might be treated as a football-playing tomboy. But Eudy herself told her grandma, "My soul is liberated when I play it. It makes me happy." And that was enough for her grandma. It was enough for her whole family. They accepted Eudy as she was. And she deeply loved football. It was like she came out of her mama and her soul was already connected to the sport. It was her destiny, and she was going to make a real difference. In her teens, she began playing for her local club, who at the time were called Kwa Thema Ladies, now known as the Springs Home Sweepers. Her first position was as a goalie, but she wanted more. She wanted to be out there, running with the ball, commanding the pitch. She knew that to be able to advance to a midfielder position, she needed to work on her fitness. And so Eudy dedicated hours in the gym every single day. She honed her skills and eventually she got her wish. She became a midfielder, and a ruthless one at that. If another team beat hers, Eudy would swear to double their winning score the next time they faced off, and she always made good on her word. Eudy was so determined that she would come back with a vengeance and she would blow the other team out of the water. She started coaching youth teams and she pursued football professionally with dreams of making it to the national team. And soon, it was all going to pay off. Around 1998, Eudy would have been around 21 when she became the first ever player from her local team to be selected to play for South Africa's national team. She did it. Back then, the team was called Banyana Banyana. It had been created in 1993 as apartheid was coming to an end, with sports finally ending their racial segregation. As far as we can tell, Eudy got on well with this team. Her teammates admired her, and for good reason, because with Eudy, the national team qualified for Africa's World Cup finals and finally started gaining recognition internationally. Not only was this amazing for Eudy and her team, but for women's football as a whole. It was rising in popularity, becoming more and more celebrated, and so was Eudy Simelane. She was becoming a real football star, not only in her township, but throughout the whole of South Africa. Alongside making a name for herself as a footballer, Eudy was also becoming a very well-known activist for the gay community. She was very, very proud of her identity. She never tried to hide it or change it, and she wanted every other LGBTQ+ person to feel like they could do the same. She was one of the first famous and openly gay people in South Africa, openly lesbian at least. She paired her status in football with her activism, and she volunteered hours of her time advocating for gay rights, for protection, freedom, acceptance, supporting people in the community with AIDS, which sadly has a long history of being intertwined with the homophobic crime of corrective rape. A major consequence for victims is often contracting AIDS, with Black lesbians contracting HIV from sexual violence at an alarming rate. For example, while we were researching Eudy's case, we came across another woman's story. Her name is Simphiwe Thandeka, and like Eudy, she grew up as a tomboy, but her family were nowhere near as accepting. When she was just 13 years old, Simphiwe was raped by her own uncle, who believed in the method of corrective rape. Traumatized, Simphiwe went and told her mum and her grandma about this attack, but they told her to never speak about it ever again. Realizing that Simphiwe was unchanged, her uncle was now insistent that a straight marriage was the only thing that would work. So he took her to a friend's house and ditched her there. While she was stranded at this random man's house, Simphiwe was beaten and raped multiple times. This man ended up telling Simphiwe's uncle that he couldn't marry her because she was still gay. The corrective rape wasn't working. And that's when her uncle offered to pay this man to just take her as his wife anyway. Soon after this, Simphiwe ended up in the hospital and was given the horrific news from doctors that she was pregnant. Not only that, she was also HIV positive, and it had been her own uncle who had given her HIV. She even said, "My mum had known that my uncle was positive, but she never told me." These sorts of stories, these horrific, life-changing, truly nightmarish experiences for gay people were, and unfortunately still are, so common. So today we want to platform an incredible charity in South Africa called the Triangle Project, which does critical work and has been the light at the end of so many stories like Simphiwe's. The Triangle Project not only provides members of the gay community who have suffered sexual and physical violence with resources like health checks and counselling, but they also go a step further for the future. They're actively fighting for a world where corrective rape doesn't exist anymore. The charity was established in 1981 by a group of gay men in an effort to fight against AIDS and HIV. They set up medical services, helplines, and from there, the organisation has just grown, it's snowballed, and become a critical place for LGBTQ Black South Africans to seek help and support. Please do consider donating to them this Pride Month. As we said earlier in this episode, this is a national emergency, and your contribution to fight for an end is even more valuable than you might think. As always, the link to this charity and many others can be found in the description of this episode. I pray that none of you will require their services, but the Triangle Project is there for you if and when you do. And now it's time to talk about the horrific attack on Eudy Simelane. She was just 31 years old. She had just gotten a new job at a law firm in April of 2008. As much as she wanted to dedicate her life to purely activism and football, neither of those things were really paying her, so she was excited to now be on a good salary that she could use to help support her family. She'd even excitedly taken her mum, Mally, to look around the new offices, but deep down, Eudy knew that this job wouldn't be permanent because she was going to make sure that football paid one day. She actually had dreams of becoming the country's first ever female referee, and she set her sights on qualifying in time to ref for the 2010 FIFA World Cup, which was being held in South Africa. Only Eudy wouldn't live to see that World Cup. 4 men made sure of that. On Saturday, 27th of April 2008, Eudy and her friends went out to celebrate her achievements. She'd already begun her referee training, she had this new job at the law firm, so a night of drinking and chatting in the local tavern was in order. I think it's important to note that our Eudy was quite the local celebrity in her township. Everyone knew of her, so she was turning heads, people were saying hi to her, and eventually the night ended at 1:30 a.m. It was a short walk back to Eudy's home from the tavern. She'd done it multiple times before after a night out, drinking, taverning. She'd be home in no time. Part of the walk was across a big field that backed onto residential housing. And I'm not going to lie, this stretch of barren land was kind of a hotspot for gang violence, for crime, even dumping literal dead bodies. But this was the only route to Eudy's house. Everyone had to walk it, whether they liked it or not. And on this particular night, there was something awful lurking in the fields. As they made their way through the darkness, Eudy and her friends clocked a group of 4 men following them. She might have even recognized one of them from around town, but there was no time for her to even be sure of that. Within seconds, the 4 men suddenly picked up the pace and ran at her. Eudy and her friends realized, we need to run. The whole group began sprinting off, but it seemed like the men weren't interested in chasing down any of Eudy's friends. They were chasing Eudy specifically. They caught up with her pretty quickly and immediately knocked her to the ground. She was outnumbered, she was overpowered, and there was nothing she could do to protect herself. What happened next is nothing short of horrific. They ripped all of her clothes off of her, dragged her into a ditch, and all of the men took turns beating her, raping her, and finally stabbing her multiple times all over her body, including even her face and the soles of her feet. Throughout this whole attack, Eudy was screaming for help. Remember, these fields backed onto some houses, and we know that people were within earshot, hearing distressed women's cries, but no one actually came to help Eudy. Because, as I said, this place was famously a hotspot for murder and violence. It wasn't unusual to hear screams like this, but the residents couldn't really do anything about it unless they wanted to be attacked as well. It's also important to note that people living in townships have complex relationships with law enforcement, because I'm sure a few of you are thinking, well, okay, they don't need to get involved themselves, but why not call the police? But many people in these townships felt a deep sense of distrust within the police. They had experienced first-hand corruption when dealing with them. And also the police were pretty notorious for delayed response times and keeping a low profile in high crime areas, I think just because they don't really want to get involved. So this distrust in the police meant that Eudy was left lying in that ditch all alone, only partially clothed, where she would soon die from her injuries and blood loss, while her 4 attackers ran away, having stolen her phone, her watch, and even the football boots from her feet. When the sun rose the next morning, the residents who had heard the screams from the night before went outside, fully expecting to find a dead body. And there they found the township's celebrity, the international South African footballing hero who was going to be their first ever female referee. It was Eudy Simelane. She was only 31 years old and one of the most important LGBTQ figures the country ever had. That morning, Eudy's older brother, Bafana, was at his grandma's house. He was listening to music when a woman from the local area came knocking on the front door. She told him that word was going round that his sister had died, and she wanted to check if it was true. Bafana was shocked, like quite speechless. This had seemingly come out of nowhere, and now Bafana's thinking, well, is this woman messing with me? Was this just like a twisted rumor? He knew that he had literally seen Eudy the day before. This woman had to be mistaken. And he told her as much, that Eudy was fine, as far as he knew. But 10 minutes later, his phone rang. It was his parents' next door neighbour. A little bit random. He asked if everything was okay. Was there a problem? The neighbour said, yes, everything is okay. There's no problem. We just need to speak with you. Come down to the house, like, now. So he got a taxi back to his parents' house, which even drove past the strip of land where Eudy had been attacked. And Bafana had no idea. He had noticed police on the field and a bunch of people gathered around, but he hadn't made the connection with what the neighbour had said to him earlier. It wasn't until he pulled up at his parents' house when he realised the police were there too. He was told he needed to go to the station to speak with the police. His mum was already there. She had gone through all of this earlier that morning. When she first woke up, she walked past Eudy's bedroom and down the hall, and she actually thought that she could hear Eudy's TV turned on in her room. So she kind of took that as confirmation that her daughter had gotten home safe the night before. But when she was called up and asked to make her way down to the police station, she had no idea what it could have been for. As far as she was aware, all of her family were accounted for. Her husband was at work, Bafana was at his grandma's, Eudy was in her bedroom watching TV. On top of the general worry, Eudy's mum was also very wary of police in general, like I was saying about everyone in the townships. I mean, corruption is everywhere in all law enforcement, and the sheer racism that we know historically and still in modern times remains a huge threat for people of colour when it comes to interacting with law enforcement. This is a woman who had lived practically her whole entire life under apartheid. Her experience with the police would have been horrendous. She avoided crossing paths with them at all costs. But now, here she was, sitting at the station, waiting for her son to arrive to tell him that their beloved Eudy had been murdered. The police took both Mali and Bafana to the strip of land where Eudy had been killed, but Bafana was insistent that he didn't want his mother to see Eudy's dead body. He very bravely said that he would be the one to go ahead and identify her. But one thing that he couldn't hide from his mother was the blood that was all over the ground below them. There was so much of it, and under the heat of the sun, it had all dried into the dirt. Now, Bafana did something quite unexpected, and before I tell you, I need you to bear in mind that the family were in complete shock. This was so sudden that a beloved member of their family was there yesterday and is gone today. Bafana saw his sister's dried blood in the dirt, and the idea of leaving some of her behind just broke his heart. Without much thought, he collapsed onto the ground and started clawing at it, scooping up Eudy's blood into his hands and shoveling it into his mouth. Obviously, people tried to stop him, but he told them, "This is my blood, I will not leave it here." He said that he would take her with him, and the people who did this to her will be found. One by one, they will be found. Her whole entire family was so devastated, so shocked. Her dad broke down, and so did the community that loved her. They all called Eudy a diamond, but now their diamond was gone forever. Her murder made the national news and headlines all around the world, and because of the scrutiny that the South African police were now under, they acted quickly, unusually quickly for a crime involving a black lesbian from the townships, may I add, because, as I said before, police weren't known for quick response times within the townships. Within 24 to 28 hours, all 4 men had been taken into custody for the robbery, rape, and murder of Eudy Simelane. One of them, 23-year-old Tato Mpiti, had actually voluntarily handed himself in when he heard that police were looking for him. All 4 of Eudy's killers were younger than her. They were between the ages of 18 and 24 years old, and there wasn't a doubt in Bafana's mind that his sister's murder had been planned in advance. The 4 men knew who she was, and they had targeted her because she was Eudy Simelane, an openly masked lesbian. But it was now when things would take a turn, because although her attackers had been caught, Eudy's family and her community still relied on the courts to give her justice. And that is something that they just couldn't rely on. A court date was set for February of 2009, and there the 4 men charged with murder, robbery with aggravating circumstances, and rape stood in front of a judge to have their fates decided. But these 4 were all over the place with their story, and so was the first judge. And I say first judge because we're going to need 2 trials and 2 judges to get any sort of justice for Eudy. The first trial was held in February, and during that, the fella that turned himself in, 23-year-old Tato Mpiti, pleaded guilty, and in doing so, he implicated all 3 of the others. He told the court that all 4 of them had sat in the tavern drinking heavily all night until they set out with the intent to roam the streets looking for victims to rob. And as they prowled the streets, they spotted Eudy, the locally famous footballer. They chased her down, but when they realised that she didn't have that much money on her, only a mobile phone, they dragged her into a ditch to rape and murder her instead. One of the 4 men was actually familiar to Eudy from around town. She would have recognised him. She would have been able to give his name over to the police if she had to. And that, apparently, played a deciding factor as to why they killed her. Tato said, "I panicked because I didn't want to be arrested." And when he was asked why he wanted to plead guilty, he said, "I felt bad and ashamed about what I did. I want to take responsibility for my actions." But as for the other 3, well, their stories did not match Tato's. They all insisted that Eudy hadn't been targeted, that the rape had nothing to do with her being a lesbian, that they didn't even know who she was. Tato Mpiti, the one who had pled guilty, was sentenced to 32 years in prison, while a second trial was scheduled for the other 3 after they denied Tato's version of events. By the end of the first trial, it had become very clear that the judge was biased. He insisted that this case was simply a violent robbery gone wrong, not a sexually violent attack out of hatred for a masked lesbian. The judge explicitly said in his statement that Eudy being gay had, quote, "no significance in this case," to which gay rights activists across not only South Africa but also the whole world called him out on, saying how dangerous it was for him to not even recognise how disproportionately lesbians face rape and murder in South Africa. Lesbians who'd even attended the hearing that day said that they were threatened by young men telling them, no matter what transpires in court, we are going to eliminate the lesbians and gays. Which is a hate crime in itself, surely. After Tato was sentenced, he promised to testify against the 3 others in the second trial. He clearly felt some level of remorse for what they'd all done, and now he was going to take the other 3 down with him, as he should. But when the next court date was set, only a few months later, suddenly Tato had changed his mind, and he was refusing to testify. Don't piss me off. Like, apparently he had found God and said that he didn't want to speak or something, which doesn't really make sense to me unless he had been threatened to keep his mouth shut by the others on the outside. But even then, like, you're going down for 32 years, bro. I don't think you have too much to worry about when it comes to people on the outside. Like, you've already told the court everything once, and you can't exactly take that back. Anyway, by pulling out at the final minute, he had thrown off the entire prosecution that was heavily relying on his testimony, and this massively delayed the second trial, which finally began in September, and a new judge was assigned to oversee the case. But this new judge didn't exactly get things going on a promising note either. When he asked the prosecutor, "Is there another word that you can use instead of lesbian?" And honestly, this was a bad indicator to everyone following the trial. There had been protests and rallies, not just in South Africa, but worldwide, calling for all three of the remaining perpetrators to be sentenced to life in prison, for this crime to be acknowledged as a homophobic hate crime, to call out the corrective rapes that had been used as a weapon against lesbians for years. And I guess most importantly for this case, everyone was just pleading for all three men to be found guilty, no matter what. Because despite the barbaric violence against lesbians that had been happening long before 2008, barely any crimes of this nature had even sent someone to prison, let alone been legally acknowledged as a hate crime. For example, only the year before Eudy's rape and murder, a lesbian couple from a township were heckled and followed by a man when they were leaving a bar. They were beaten, stripped, tied up, gang raped, and shot dead. Their names were Sizakele Sigasa and Salome Masua, and no one had been charged for their murder. And sadly, Eudy's second trial would only further add to the statistics of low conviction rates, because out of the three attackers left on trial charged with Eudy's rape and murder, two of them were actually acquitted. Their names were Kumbulani Magagula and Johannes Mahlangu. They got away with it. Despite having been implicated in Tato's guilty plea the first time in court, they were able to walk free, with the judge declaring that there just wasn't enough evidence to charge them in the trial. But the judge did say that God would be their judge in the next life, indicating that he thinks they're guilty, although legally his hands are tied. If Tato wasn't going to testify against them officially, then there wasn't really any concrete evidence, even though everyone knew the truth. And that is just such a sickening feeling. An acquittal for two of them was not what anyone wanted. But there would be at least some justice. The remaining of the four perpetrators was 24-year-old Themba Mvubu. He was found guilty, and it might have actually been his own brother who got him sentenced. His brother actually testified in court, saying that on the night of Eudy's murder, Themba had come home with his trousers covered in bloodstains. He was literally wearing Eudy's football boots as well, the ones that had been stolen from her dead body. As a result, Themba was sentenced to 35 years altogether, but despite having denied everything and pleading not guilty this whole time, once he was actually found guilty, he changed his tune completely. He started telling the court and the press that he wasn't sorry for what he had done to Eudy, that he didn't regret it. He seems like pure evil. There's a special place in hell for someone like him. There's zero remorse here, but also, isn't this wild? Because clearly that's an admission of guilt, right? How frustrating that a decision was already made when he starts opening up and saying that he doesn't regret what he did. It's frustrating that we can't just do another trial and say, well, we have the evidence now out of your own damn mouth. After the second trial came to a close, this second judge actually acknowledged that Eudy's sexuality may have had some significance in her murder. Might have had some significance. It's still so frustrating that her murder was never classed as a hate crime, but at least this acknowledgement is a baby step in the right direction. It's the bare minimum, but hopefully it leads momentum to make some change over there in the South African courts when it comes to hate crimes. Gay rights activists were loud about this, and they advocated further for the need to start implementing more legal framework to be able to convict and class cases like this as hate crimes. And for one of the first times ever, the term corrective rape and what was happening to the gay community in South Africa made its way into the mainstream international media. It was Eudy's case that achieved this, mainly because she was something of a national treasure over there. It was her life's work and her dream to become a football hero. Her endless hours of aid work and activism for gay rights bought her a status that meant if something happened to her, it wouldn't happen quietly. And now, even though 4 evil men had ended her life in the most horrifying way, the power that Eudy's name had and her legacy led to important changes being made. Critical awareness was raised across the world for a community of people who had been shunned, violated, and ignored when they cried out for help their entire lives. A memorial was held in Kwa Thema at Eudy's local church. Churches in these townships had often been unwelcoming of the gay community, despite some of them actually being desperate to integrate gay people into their congregations. They just hadn't done so because they were worried about backlash. But at Eudy's local church, at this memorial, the priest opened his doors and specifically welcomed the gay community. I'm not sure if he expected this, but the crowd erupted in cheers, just so happy to even be acknowledged in a church, let alone welcomed for who they are. For the next 40 years after Eudy's death, her mum, Mally, dedicated her life to becoming South Africa's most visible and vocal parent to the LGBTQIA+ community. She advocated for acceptance, for respect and rights for gay people across South Africa. In 2019, in her 70s, Mally passed away. Her daughter had changed South Africa, and now so had she. I guess it could be surprising just how tough life is for gay people in South Africa when you actually take into account the country's quite progressive laws. I didn't know this before researching for this case, but South Africa isn't exactly behind when it comes to gay rights in many aspects. For example, they were the 5th country in the world to legalise gay marriage back in 2006. The UK didn't legalise it here until 2014. But progressiveness doesn't always apply when you look at it through the lens of intersectionality, which is really what Eudy and all of the other black lesbians from the townships were going up against. Being a woman in South Africa back then and today is no joke. I mean, being a woman anywhere in the world is fucking hard, but South Africa is notorious for its sexism and violence against women. Like a lot of places, harmful gender norms and violence against women are deeply, deeply ingrained in societal norms. During this research, we came across some really shocking statistics, like a girl in South Africa is more likely to be raped than to learn how to read. Many times people have tried to debunk this claim, but then it just gets reproven, and then people debunk it again and it gets reproven a few times over. But I do want to give some clarity on how these gender-based crimes are such a national emergency in South Africa. For example, in a very recent study of 1,000 random households in South Africa, 70% of men said that a wife should obey her husband, and 15% said that they had the right to punish her if she did something wrong. But I think possibly the scariest of the statistics that we found was that 23% of men believed that a wife cannot refuse sex with her husband. He is entitled to it whenever he pleases. And 12% of these men believed that if a woman doesn't put up a physical fight to stop a rape from happening, then it doesn't count as rape. And that's just the ones who were willing to be honest in this survey. In reality, these kind of statistics are always higher than what's reported because people don't want to admit the truth and how they feel. Violence against women is so rampant. South Africa reports around 40,000 rapes per year. But when we look at the violence the subsections of women are facing, it gets even worse. To look at only black women, for example, they face a hugely higher risk than white women when it comes to gender-based violence in South Africa. This is largely a consequence of apartheid, where these women were made to live in areas of high poverty, high crime, high unemployment, and low education. Obviously, all of this doesn't just end when apartheid does. It takes decades to dismantle that structure and to end that cycle. And it isn't just a racial issue. Intersectionality doesn't only apply to race, it applies to all subsections, all groups. For example, women with disabilities also experience a disproportionate level of violence. Another subsection would be sexuality, like lesbians, and a further subsection would be black lesbians, and to go even further, black mask lesbians, which is what Eudy Simelane was. And as we know from Eudy's case, the more subsections that you fit in, the more danger and the lack of opportunities you live with. And as a result, the more likely that person falls victim to discriminatory crimes like corrective rape. Corrective rape wasn't and isn't just to quote unquote cure gay people. It's used to torture them, to punish them, to degrade, humiliate, and strip them of their power and autonomy. And it is still happening at alarming rates. And it isn't just happening to masked lesbians. It's happening to trans people, to gay men, to femme lesbians, non-binary people, to bisexuals. And it needs to end. I would like to end this episode just by giving a little reminder about the Triangle Project that we spoke about earlier. They are working tirelessly to educate and to spread awareness and help members of the LGBTQ plus community in South Africa. So if you need them, and I pray that you don't, but if you do, the link will be down below in the description. And as I asked earlier, it is Pride Month. Please do consider donating. They're doing amazing, amazing work that needs the funding so desperately. And of course, there will be our link tree down below with a bunch of resources. We're always adding more. So if you need any help or you want to find any charities, go take a gander. There's so much to find down there. But thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Outlaw Podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, leave us a comment so that we can continue the conversation. If you're listening on a podcast platform, please rate us 5 stars and also leave us a comment. I've been reading the comments on Spotify recently. I didn't even know that they had those until recently, but I see you. I read them all. And yeah, I will see you in the next episode. Bye.